Welcome to the Week 15 Slate Breakdown. I'm Jason Gilbo at JGilbo11. With me is Russell Clay at Russell J. Clay. We're starting to get divvied up some leagues. Russ luckily woke up for us this morning, and people were not happy that you went to bed at 4 o'clock yesterday. You were spewing out a lot of hot takes, and people weren't having it.
Yeah, you can't – it's like – you can't expect Santa to be happy every day of the year. Yeah, he shows up on Christmas happy, but he's not Santa all year round. You know what I'm saying? He ramps up for that one day. I ramp up usually, for you guys, but you saw how I normally am. This grumpy, slightly negative, passive aggressive, crapping on ideas. I mean, we can throw out, the people throwing out the Alabama depth chart tweets, in 2013. You know who isn't relevant? Alvin Kamara in 2013. He might as well have been, playing at his local flag football league because he was sixth on the depth chart and didn't get any touches. So let's not put him on the Alabama depth chart for 2013. Stop making those tweets. Thank you very much. Let's start the week.
I don't even know where that came from, but
LT10 and D Hart were better prospects than him, and he's annoying. All right, let's go.
This week, we kind of got a little bit of a shortened main slate. FanDuel got away from the Sunday night game. We got the 2 Saturday games now moving forward. It's not a great slate here. As far as the main one goes, we have a couple of good games to target. We were running through some guys here earlier, and it was just kind of seeing – there's one or two kind of one-off plays, I think, from each one for me that I'm looking at. I think outside of maybe one or two teams that I'm really looking to go after, I'm going to be pretty narrow this week.
So I'm pretty narrow with the base plays, but I actually think this is a great game stack week, especially with Rodgers coming back. I'm looking at that Green Bay Carolina game, and I really don't know what to expect. It could be a 17-10, just nothing game, but there's another end where Rodgers, if Rodgers can move the ball on Carolina, that could end up being a shootout. So I'm looking at that game. Philly, New York, I think could be a really interesting game stack. LA, Seattle, Russell Wilson scores at will every week. So I don't love those games, but I do think there's this weird range of outcomes upside. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I don't know about you, but I'm kind of looking more at a smaller sample size of fantasy points allowed this week in terms of just kind of looking more at the last 5, because we've kind of seen defenses obviously get really banged up. We've seen defenses kind of start to fall off, and we're kind of looking at defenses that maybe not necessarily were the same defenses they were 5, 6, 7 weeks ago. We look at kind of Carolina, we look at Seattle, those defenses are struggling right now.
And we look at teams like the Chargers and the Dolphins, who have just totally flipped a weird switch, especially the Dolphins because they're out of playoff contention, but they've flipped a crazy switch the last few weeks. Obviously, Chargers not on the main slate. But yeah, I think you're right. I think we have to start looking at this as a week-to-week timeline, last 3 weeks of the year. Tons of injuries, teams falling out of playoff contention. Jimmy Garoppolo just hammering good defenses probably from now on. So, you got to take things into account.
Yeah, you do here. And let's jump into quarterbacks this week. Obviously, we got the news last night that Aaron Rodgers was cleared to play. Let's I guess start with him. Are you going to get some exposure this week?
Oh yeah, fire away. This is going to be, this is fun. Again, I went on a little, talk about Green Bay. Their offense sucks without Rodgers. If we want to debate, their skill position players, then we can go bit by bit. But if you like Lance Kendricks and Richard Rodgers, then that's what we got for you in Green Bay. But with Rodgers, he's so special. Jordy Nelson, I don't think he's a very good receiver at this stage. But he has the imprint of one, and him and Rodgers have that crazy chemistry. I think he's great. I don't even know. Well, I guess I'll ask you, What do you think the ownership's going to be? Because are they even going to be contrarian, or are they just going to be? It's pretty early in the week they announced this, so it's like, is that ownership just going to kind of be there?
I don't think so. I mean, I think it's going to be pretty average. I don't think it's going to be what you want. But I mean, kind of looking, I think a lot of people are going to be looking at their wide receivers because I know prices did come back up on some of them. Like Jordy Nelson is back up at a higher price tag compared to where he was over the prior weeks. Randall Cobb's still cheap. Adams is still in that mid range. Like, I don't know. I mean, I think the ownership's going to be fairly average, like 15, 18% for these guys for some of them, maybe a little bit less, but it's Rodgers. Like the hype's going to follow him. And given the fact that Carolina's hasn't really been great against quarterbacks over the last few weeks. Like, especially given the fact that Green Bay needs to keep winning. Like, this is a must-win game for Green Bay here.
And exactly. And I think we know what that means in terms of end of game play, which is where sometimes we see a lot of Rodgers fantasy points, especially if they're trailing. So if Carolina blows them out, that's another game flow we could potentially be interested in. So either the Packers move the ball or Carolina just blows them out. I think either of those, you're looking at a pretty good situation. So I think you have to be worried about him as well, health-wise. You know, if he takes another big hit, he could be out in the first quarter. So I think you do have to be aware of that if you're playing him. If you get 50% exposure, you know, you could be tilting pretty hard as, 20 minutes into that game.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, he's just going to be a tournament option this week. And I think when you look, Russell Wilson, like he just kind of once again comes in the standout spot here. He's at home against a Rams defense that they're another one that got banged up last week. And Wilson is he's giving you a floor that I just don't feel anyone else can give you right now.
Yeah, you just play Russell Wilson. You just play him. I don't care. Like after last week, you just play him. It doesn't even need to be talked about. No matter what, he figures it out. So whether it's 70-yard touchdown passes, rushing yards, like running, he's going to get his. So just take it and be happy with it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm going to be lock and loading some Wilson. What are you doing with this Pittsburgh New England game as far as the passing games go?
So I actually don't love this game other than Gronk as, probably as much as the consensus. I'd imagine based on the last few weeks, we see Brown and Bell at 20 to 30%, probably 25 to 30%. And I think they're viable fades this week. I know that doesn't have anything to do with quarterback, but it kind of does have to do with Roethlisberger. I'm kind of okay with, fading Pittsburgh this week against a Patriots team who's been limiting a lot of offenses of late. They had a weird game in Miami. They always kind of struggle in Miami. I think it's kind of back to normal here. But I don't love the Patriots offense either. I don't really know who to play other than Gronk at this stage in the season. So it's kind of tough to stack Brady. Like if I play Brady, I want to play him with someone. And, I guess it'd only be Gronk for me right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think I prefer obviously Wilson over Brady in terms of that top tier, like as far as where I'm going. And I think Roethlisberger's in play this week. I know, obviously New England has been pretty stout against passing games of late, but, we saw Cutler go out there and dial up 3 touchdowns this past week. I know they still looked bad, but New England's played Nathan Peterman, Matt Moore, Derek Carr, Brock Osweiler over the last few weeks. Like, it hasn't really been great offenses to go up against. And this is kind of like last year where they struggled and then they hit their stride of schedule where they're playing a lot of bad teams. So, at home, I think Roethlisberger can get it done. I think this game, not shootout potential, but I think it's going to be one of those 27-24 games where if you get the right touchdowns, you're going to be fine. I don't think we see anything like we did last week with Baltimore and Pittsburgh, where that was just kind of out of the norm for those two. So I'll be looking at Roethlisberger this week in GPPs. I still will probably just be looking to go Wilson over Brady and rather get my Brady exposure through his weapons like Gronk or Chris Hogan or Cooks or something like that.
Yeah, that's certainly fair. I'll be interested in what the weather is. Obviously, another factor outdoors in December. Could be in the 40s, could be in the 30s, which will obviously be fine. But sometimes both those teams kind of sit on the ball some games. So obviously they're great plays, all of them. I'm not saying that, but I think they are very fadeable.
Yeah. We kind of move into the middle tier here. You mentioned Carolina possibly getting up. Like, do you have any interest in Cam Newton at all?
Yes, I do. I think Cam Newton's always a great contrarian play. He has been quite a few times this year, and he's sort of getting a pretty decent floor the last 5 or so weeks. Over 15 FanDuel points every week. Had that 35-point game against Miami. Has had, quite a few games above 20 fantasy points this year. It's just kind of random when it happens. I think this could be one of those games where passing games work and maybe gets a rushing touchdown. I mean, Jonathan Stewart, he had 3 rushing touchdowns last game. That's not going to continue. So if as long as they continue to get those goal line touches, especially against Green Bay, they should be able to move the ball. So yeah, I like him quite a bit. Not touching Cousins. I'm not really going near Goff this week. I know me and you might differ there a little bit. And I know you like Keenum, but really, I mean, really it's Wilson seems like, the cop-out move, but I feel like Wilson's just the play.
He is. I think when you kind of go in this mid-range, like I'm with you. I like Newton here in this spot. He's given you a pretty good rushing floor of late. He's not throwing for a ton of yards, but the touchdowns are there. Green Bay defense, that's 6-month fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks over the last 5 weeks. They really just haven't been that great of a defense overall this year anyway. I don't mind kind of going that route and using Newton or a Newton Funches stack here and hoping for that potential shootout.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned Keenum. I'm a big fan of Keenum this week. He's been over 20 fantasy points in 2 of the last 3 games. He's been, pretty solid. Like, he's going to give you another rushing floor. He could have that potential rushing touchdown, but obviously I think there's still 3 to 4 fantasy points just solely off rushing yards alone. This Cincinnati defense has really struggled, 4th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, over the last 5 weeks. I mentioned to you the quarterbacks that I named were just not great. I mean, bottom 10 guys in the league. So they're clearly struggling. Minnesota at home there. I just feel like he's kind of a little bit underpriced for his recent production, and he's got good stacking partners too.
He's a great cash game guy. I mean, there's just you read to me before the show the last 5 opponents, and it's like all of them were between that 17 to 20 range. And there were some bad quarterbacks in there. So I think Keenum's one of the highest floor guys on the slate. And obviously you have a great stacking option in Thielen. That's going to get you another 15 to 17, just automatically. So that's a great combination. People like playing Jimmy G. I haven't really felt the need to play him the last few weeks, and I don't really feel the need to play him this week. As you mentioned with him and some of the other options, down there. Are you playing Jimmy G this week?
Maybe in the late slate,
Yeah,
the 4 o'clock
I
only
think you're
slate.
better off doing something like that.
Like Newton has a higher ceiling, Keenum has a higher ceiling.
Bortles has a higher ceiling to me.
Yeah, like he's a little priced up. We talked about in the salary exploitation pod, and it was just kind of more of a, hey, these guys are a little bit more expensive, but they're still in play. Like more so Goodwin. Like I don't mind Garoppolo in the later slate. Like he's in a pretty good spot at home.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, if you're kind of building for the main slate, obviously I think you got to still look more and more at the guys around him like Keenan and Newton because they're just right there.
Right. So I like Garoppolo. I just might not get a ton of exposure. Speaking of, though, I love Joe Flacco. No, wouldn't that be funny if I just all in on Joe Flacco this week?
Well, would it be the first time this year?
No, sadly. There was a few times early in the year where I thought Joe Flacco was in decent spots. I actually do think he's in a decent spot. I just don't think you need to play him in DFS,
No, for me, I'd rather go Nick Foles. I'll even go Blake Bortles over Joe Flacco. I think a reasonable outcome for Nick Foles this week. I'm a little bit worried here, I guess, with the potential upside because the fact that they have Ajayi, they have like Garrett Blunt, they could easily kind of run this game because New York is not a great run defense either, and kind of control the clock a little bit
Mm,
here and kind of see a grinded out game where, you know, though they don't let him air it out 40 times, they don't let him take a little bit of chances. So I kind of worry about the upside for Foles this week. I can't deny the price tag and the fact that he'll probably go out and hit value, but I don't know if he's going to hit that GPP value that you need, you know, in comparison to some of these other guys that we're looking at.
absolutely. I think his floor is between 10 and 15 points. As you mentioned, if they just sit on the ball, they have two good running backs now. So that's definitely a possibility. But I think he's got a huge range of outcomes. We've actually seen Nick Foles be pretty good before. So he's got a great offense around him. He definitely could pull it off. So I like him quite a bit. Don't love him on Yahoo just because, you don't really get the discount. He's 27. But FanDuel, I mean, 6K. That's great.
Yeah, I mean that's one of those ones where you want to plug in Antonio Brown, you want to plug in some of these higher
Right.
price options. Like I have nothing against it if those guys can get 30 plus fantasy points and kind of carry a Fool's 15.
Absolutely.
So I think that's it for me at quarterback. I mean, I am going to be narrow. I think that mid tier is kind of what I'm liking, and then Wilson.
Absolutely. Totally
So
agree.
let's move on to running back here this week. Obviously, Le'Veon Bell's on the slate. Has only played New England twice, in his history. Obviously, we've seen Bell really bounce back after a couple of kind of average games before that. The passing work that he's getting right now is back. I mean, 10, 6, 14, 11 targets over the last 4 weeks. Touchdowns have been there. I like Bell on DK this week because I think the PPR floor is still fairly safe. He's a high price tag. I still think Pittsburgh can put up 3-4 touchdowns in this matchup. So Bell's another one. You made the logistics to kind of fade, in GPPs if you want to go that route. But obviously a guy who still carries a pretty high floor.
Yeah, he's a great play. No denying that. I just think we've seen the Patriots sort of go through this time after time where they just, they don't totally limit. Like he'll get 17 to 20 points. It's just I don't know that he's going to get that 30 this week, and that's what you need to play Bell. You need 30. So, you need 25 on FanDuel, 30 on DK. But I don't know. I just think there's other decent options, especially at the top. So I think you can sort of, finagle your way around it. Maybe pay up, elsewhere. Pay up for Gronk, or do other things, or be creative at other spots instead of Bell at 25 to 30% owned.
Yeah, I mean the problem for me is basically it comes down to kind of the Saints running backs,
Mhm.
and Le'Veon Bell is kind of the top options this week. I mean, Kamara should be back after the concussion. Obviously when people look, like Jets defense has been, decent this year. They're 13th in DVOA. This is just such a prime spot though for the running backs because they're going to be in such a good game script this week with the Jets, being 2 touchdown underdogs, losing a pretty, leader, a good leadership role in that locker room with McCown. Like the season's it's going to start to fall here. And I think at home, like, I mean, pick your poison, I guess, with Kamara and Ingram. I think I like Ingram a little bit more this week because I can see him kind of getting pounded the rock, 20 times here.
Yeah, I like both. I think they're both in play. Tougher to play Kamara. He's so high priced now. It was weird. They sort of took that week off to price him up even more. So when he comes back, especially on Yahoo and FanDuel, so he's in play. I mean, he's averaging 30 points a game or whatever, but coming off concussion, um, more of a contrarian play for me than a cash play. Uh, Obviously, Ingram, great play. McCoy, what are you doing with McCoy and Gurley this week? That's kind of the tough question.
Yeah, I mean, I like McCoy here. He's going to be probably a fairly lower owned guy out of this top tier. There's just not a lot of great running backs and great spots this week. So I think you do have to at least consider McCoy. Miami allowing 24 fantasy points per game over the last 5 weeks to running backs. We know McCoy's going to have a high workload. Obviously, last week it was mainly due to the weather where he got 32 touches and the overtime game. But, I mean, he's a workhorse and he can work in the passing game. I think regardless of kind of who's under center, like I know a lot of people will be looking at the splits with Tyrod and McCoy and everything like that, but I think he's still in play. If that scares you off, I mean, that lowers the ownership for me. Like, I'm going to play McCoy in a home matchup where it should be a fairly close game. And obviously Buffalo's still fighting for playoff spots. So, if people are going to overlook him and Kamara and Ingram become really popular as they should be, McCoy's a great pivot.
You know that the Rocky and Bullwinkle, you know what that is?
Yeah, the Moose.
Yeah, you know the villains?
Yeah.
The villain guy with the little curly. Yeah, I feel like that guy right now, and I have a needle and I'm going to poke a hole in the Jamal Williams balloon because with Aaron Rodgers back, that running game is just going to shrivel up and die. And I just can't wait to watch it just shrivel up and never be seen from again. I never want that. I never want to deal with that again of just him being awful and still getting tons of fantasy points. So thankfully we won't have to deal with that again. So no, I'm not playing Jamal Williams, and I would not. I mean, there's just no way he's going to get 25 touches with Rodgers in there. So,
no, I mean, he has some passing game upside. We've seen it in over the last few games. He's just at a higher price tag than I want to pay. I mean, I kind of rather go cheaper, like Kenyon Drake's, a full 1,000 cheaper, basically, that I know you and I are both on. Before we kind of break into that tier, Gurley, are you looking at this week in GPPs at all?
Not really, no.
Leonard Fournette. What about him?
He's my top play this week.
Fournette?
So, yep. There's that.
Yeah. I mean, a home matchup with Houston, average defense.
They're so banged up at this point in the year. They've been leaking points, and this is kind of like a playoff clinching game for Jacksonville. I think, they're going to pound the rock. It looks like he's healthy again. We could see 150 yards and 2 touchdowns, so I'm just going to play him.
Yeah, I like Fournette this week. The price is down across the industry. 44 rushing attempts last 2 weeks, 10 targets. Yeah, I think the workload's back. I think he's healthy. You're looking at a pretty average rush defense here. They're allowing a ton of points. Going to be a favorable game spot for him. You know that also Jacksonville's defense is going to put Fournette in a lot of good spots too.
Mm-hmm. It just seems like it lined up to just pound Houston. So. Pay down. I mean, we joke about Carlos Hyde, but he's always a fun play, especially with Jimmy G going. I kind of think Alex Collins is in for a letdown game. Cleveland isn't great, but I don't think Collins is going to continue on this type of pace. What do you think about him?
I still like him this week. I still think he's too cheap, and obviously, 5-6 touchdowns over the last 4 weeks. I mean, obviously it's been kind of at an unreal pace, but the touches are there. He's getting a couple targets in the passing game, and he's getting good, effective targets. I mean, longs for 37, 14, and 21 over the last 3 weeks. I still like him. I think at 5K DraftKings, like he's still, he's better than Ajayi. He's better than Murray. Like he's better than Bernard this week. He's better than Lewis. Like the opportunity's there here for more of a higher ceiling, I think, with him. So I'm still on it. Cleveland's been struggling against the run over the last few weeks. I like him quite a bit. I think really in this tier, like Drake and Collins are guys that I'll be using quite a bit of.
You know what I'm really excited for this week? DeMarco Murray's 14 carries for 37 yards. I can't wait. Let's go, baby. Let's waste another good matchup, Mike Mularkey. Woo! Let's go.
Could you play Derrick Henry to be contrarian?
No. It's just so annoying because even if he breaks a big run, he's got 13 points. And then you just got DeMarco Murray right back in the next drive to just ground and pound to a 3-and-out. It's great. I love it. It actually makes me smile at this point. Like a few weeks ago, I just started smiling at how ludicrous it is They could be winning so many games right now if they just stopped this. But I like it now. I'm ready. I'm ready for 14 carries, 16 touches. He'll get like a 15-yard grab, score 8 fantasy points, and pretty much an optimal matchup. Can't wait. Let's do it.
Yeah, it's a great spot. Like, and unfortunately, they're both cheap. They're both basically the same price, and they're both just putting out the same type of fantasy production because they're splitting the workload. It's
Oh,
unfortunate, and Henry's clearly the better back this year. And I mean, it is what it is. Like, you know what? Sorry, but I'm
yep.
skipping that game. If you want to play him in GPPs, you can go ahead and try and do that. But I'm going to take the workload with Collins. I'm going to take the workload with Hyde and Drake, and I'll pay 500, 600 more.
Definitely. In terms of paying down, I do think you could go with Jonathan Stewart again. I think he could get you that rushing touchdown and maybe 60, 70 yards. Obviously, you're not loving that, and you're not going to win a GPP with that. And he's not getting 30 points again like he did last week. But I do think he is viable at his price.
Yeah, I
He's
think
only
so.
4K on DK,
Yeah, I mean, I think he's in play. I think, really when you look at it, like this option, this kind of below 4,500, like there isn't anyone that stands out. We talked about Kerwin Williams on the salary exploitation pod. Like he's kind of one of those ones. If you really want to pay down at running back, you can go ahead. Like I think he can get you 10 fantasy points, and you just got to hope that that touchdown can get there. Because I mean, 36 rushing attempts over the last 2 weeks is still something to note there against a Washington team that has been struggling against the run. I I just find myself I'm not kind of dropping below 5K at running back this week. I think that's kind of how I'm going.
Yeah, agreed.
So let's move on to wide receiver here. This is a week, I think I'm going to be sitting in this mid tier as well, mainly because I want to pay up at tight end. I want to pay up a little bit at quarterback here this week. So I kind of like the mid range a lot.
Yeah, I think we've been kind of higher on the upper tier the last few weeks, but this one kind of feels like a nice pay down week. I think we both like Adam Thielen. You like Keenum, and I like Thielen quite a bit. So I think that's a great combination. Devin Funchess, Josh Gordon. I mean, without Jimmy Smith, I think we're looking at a really good matchup again. So definitely don't be afraid to play Josh Gordon. Clearly, that ownership is going to be egregious every week. He was 35% last week. That's a little silly, but I think he's going to continue to be a viable play that's going to get a lot of targets. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm with you. I definitely don't mind it. Like, I think when we look, like, there are a couple guys that I'm kind of ruling out this week. Larry Fitzgerald's a little too expensive for me. I'm kind of off of him here. I think that's kind of going to be a gross game. DeAndre Hopkins on the road against Jacksonville. I don't like the target against Jacksonville unless for some reason you can get Paul Richardson and Tyler Lockett to get some 70-yard touchdowns for you.
Wait, did you say you're off Fitzgerald?
Yeah, I'm off Fitzgerald at his price.
I'm
I rather.
terrified. Wait a second.
I know
Hold
I'm
on.
I'm so pro Fitz, but
Wait a second. I like him this week.
really,
Scared now. Maybe I shouldn't like him. We've been on the opposite end of this all year.
we have. Yeah, when I've been on him, you've been
Oh,
off.
interesting. What, you think he's going to see Norman?
No, I just think I think Arizona's just offense. They're going to struggle this week on the road. Like I know Washington's defense hasn't been
Mhm.
that great. At the price tag, like he's a little bit high for me. I kind of rather go Cooks or Baldwin or Funchess over him. I think that's kind of how I'm looking at it.
Oh yeah, no, I agree there. I am intrigued just because I've had a hard time with him this year, and it looks like kind of a game that could be really ugly, and maybe he gets one of those high target games. But yeah, no, I definitely like Adams, definitely like Funches, definitely like Gordon over him. Um, so I think that's where I'm looking to get most of my exposure. DeAndre Hopkins, obviously a brutal matchup. Can you play him against Jacksonville? Obviously got bailed out late in that other Jacksonville game. What was that? That was with no, Jacksonville. So that was week 1. He got bailed out with that touchdown at the end of the game. but he wasn't really doing that great, 7 catches on 16 targets.
No, and we've seen this before with Hopkins too. Like he's been in some tougher spots and he gets the touchdown. Like we saw it against Patrick Peterson in Arizona a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, yeah.
At his price tags, I don't want 16 fantasy points, 17
Right.
fantasy points. I mean, talking DK wise, once again, I'd rather go Thielen. I rather go Cooks. I rather kind of go. I don't hate Michael Thomas this week, and usually I do. But the Jets are bleeding fantasy points to wide receivers, and I mean I can look at Thomas here and feel pretty comfortable. I mean 30th in DVOA against wide receiver ones this year. Whole matchup, like I think he can go out and get his. Like in the passing game, there's still going to be someone that evolves. I just think Thomas is the guy, and then it's going to be a lot of the running game.
Agreed. I like him more than Robbie Anderson or AJ Green, and obviously Brown. The cash play, but. I guess we can talk about Brandon Cooks. We're not necessarily on the opposite ends of the spectrum, but I just hate his ownership every week. He was only 8% on Yahoo, but this past week, but he's usually between 20% on DK, like 18 to 25% on DK and FanDuel, and it's just like. I just never want to play Brandon Cooks for that much. I love Brandon Cooks, but you just never feel good about that because there's a 5 coming, 20% of the time.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about Cooks during his big weeks against Oakland and Miami and stuff, and it's just kind of like, if you're getting him at 20%, it's kind of you're not getting a huge edge on the field, when he goes off for his big games But you are getting a big edge if he does drop the 5 in and you fade him and he is, 15 and 20% owned, like you do have that advantage. I just look at Pittsburgh. I mean, if Hayden's back, I think that shores up their defense a little bit more in the secondary. But I mean, at this rate, they're 29th in DVOA against, deep passes, balls that travel 15 yards or more down the field. We know Cooks is a solid average at the target guy. I mean, this is a spot where I think he can pop off here. Like, I don't mind the New England wide receivers. Him and Chris Hogan are guys that I'll be keeping an eye on this week.
I think Jamison Crowder is a pretty interesting guy with the inside corners for Arizona covering him. I think that could be a really good matchup for him, especially with Cousins running for his life. And, we can talk about Vernon Davis, a tight end, but really what's happened is the offensive line has completely just cratered and they have to keep him in right now to block because they can't do anything. So short passes, that's Crowder, and maybe he can break a long one. So I kind of like him in that range as well.
Yeah, no, I don't mind him. I think him and Chris Hogan, excellent kind of PPR guys this week. I still think like Jacksonville's kind of an offense that you can feel good about it here again. Like D.D. Westbrook is seeing massive targets here again. We got to keep an eye on Allen Hurns, but I mean, 8, 9, 10, 6 targets over the last 4 weeks. He's been double digits in each of the last 3 games. Not a bad option. He's still fairly cheap, but he's not the bargain that we were getting a few weeks ago, but like he's still in play. And I talked to you earlier about, I still think Sammy Watkins is in play with Robert Woods coming back, and even in this matchup, like you're less on the Rams, and I think you're a little biased given the fact that this seems like a monster letdown spot for you. But I kind of like Goff. I think this year's a little bit different. We've seen the Rams put up good fantasy points of late, and against that Philly defense that was pretty good. I mean, a good front seven. I kind of see that's how Seattle is. Like they're still a good front seven, but their corners lack a little bit.
You know what I'll say on this week, especially on FanDuel, don't be afraid to leave like 1,500 on the table. Especially with a lot of these receivers, like if you want to fit, I really like Aguilar, but if you want to fit Aguilar and Westbrook in, and then you want to get Drake and Miami's D in, I mean, you don't have to force these salaries. You know what I mean? I feel like a lot of folks tend to like not want to leave that money on the table. But some weeks it just makes sense. And you look at some of like the GPP winning lineups, sometimes they leave like 2,000 on the table And if you want to play D.D. Westbrook and Aguilar and Funchess as your three wide receivers, and then you go Foles as well. I mean, sometimes that's just the way it goes.
I mean, especially this late in the year, you know,
Yeah, exactly.
like I think honestly, unless that 1500 is moving you from a Delaney to a Gronk,
Right, right.
something like that, or
Or you can get Brown in, definitely do that, but don't force it, especially if you're making 25 lineups. Don't be afraid to have a few with $2,000 out there.
yeah, and as far as these cheaper options at wide receivers go, I know you mentioned Nelson Aguilar because of the short targets over the last, over that game with Foles under center. If Ertz comes back, I think there's going to be a little bit of a tick down, but I like where your head's at with him. I still think he's very much in play. More of a FanDuel, more of a DK guy for me at 4,400, to where he can catch 8 balls for 60 yards and still hit 15 fantasy points.
Yeah, definitely more of a DK play, clearly. But I definitely think Foles is competent. And like you mentioned, if Ertz is back, definitely ticks him down a little bit. But he's still a cash game guy for me. And I think you're going to get pretty low-ish ownership. I think people are going to be on Foles. I don't think they're going to be on his passing, weapons. So I think you could get him at 5 to 7%. So I like him as a tournament guy.
Yeah, I do too. I mean, and really outside of that, like this is kind of where I was hinting at. Like I'm going to be narrow with these passing games. Like if I like the quarterbacks, or early, like I'm going to like the passing games. I like Funches. I'm going to get my Brady exposure through his wide receivers rather than Brady this week. Yeah, and I'm going to be going after Minnesota. Like I like Thielen here in this spot again.
Yep. I like Mike Wallace and Rashard Matthews potentially as well. I think they're both going to be guys that aren't going to see very high ownership and, are kind of those ugly, ugly passing games. So, but in pretty decent spots. I kind of like them.
Yeah, I definitely don't mind those. Like, there's a lot of good 4 to 5K GPP shots on DraftKings,
Yeah.
or 55 to 65 shots on FanDuel this week.
Mm-hmm.
So let's move on to tight end. This is a fairly
Quick one.
quick position this week. It's going to be a pay up week for me. I've been kind of hinting at this mid range, in other positions, because I do want to pay up at tight end this week. Gronk, is obviously a guy that we're going to be looking at quite a bit here, coming off back-to-back strong weeks. Before the suspension, but him and Ertz, I mean, if Ertz gets cleared here, like I love Ertz. I love Ertz on DK a whole lot here because I know that he's going to get a lot of targets with Foles under center.
And he's played with Foles before, so that's definitely a positive indicator. He's done well with Foles before. I don't have the stats in front of me, but I know Foles was responsible for one of those big games at the end of, hold on. Cock. Let me find it.
Yeah. I mean, I think when you look at Ertz here this week, one, it's always a prime matchup against the Giants. This is a team that's really struggling against tight ends. This year, I mean, obviously, you have allowed the most fantasy points per game. I think when you just look at the matchup, regardless of under center, you're going to be looking at Ertz. His targets have obviously varied. I think down the stretch here, it's a little bit reversed from the prior 2 years where he's fizzled out a little bit more, but I think that upside's back this week. He's a little bit cheaper. Like 6K on DraftKings for potential Zach Ertz is fairly cheap.
I can't find it. Oh, well. Anyway, so I think Ertz, I'm with you. I think he's a great option if he's in there. Jimmy Graham, always sort of a good tournament guy, especially if you want to stack him with Wilson. They finally learned how to use him in the red zone. Tough matchup last week, but he's the red zone guy there, so it's nice to see that. Evan Ingram, nice contrarian guy. Probably not going to get low ownership, but low-ish for a guy who's been pretty productive this year. Delaney, obviously a good play. Rudolph, I think all these guys are viable, and then I just wouldn't even think about going lower. I will say I do think you can think about Greg Olsen, but beyond that, I mean, Big Vern, always there for a big play. I just worry about the targets,
Yeah, and people are going to look at Olsen last week. I mean, he played 59 snaps, out of 63, I
Yeah.
believe, and obviously saw one target. I just don't know if he's healthy enough to get separation. That's kind of my thing. Like he played the
Exactly.
snaps. If he truly was healthy, I think there would have been 5 or 6 targets there for Olsen, and I don't know if he's healthy, man.
I agree, and that's why I don't think he's really in play this week after last week. But like, I do think you can make a Cam Olsen lineup and just kind of toss it out there. Again, if I'm making like telling people lineup construction, I would not go below Rudolph. I'm just
No.
saying for me, like I'm gonna have that 0 with Olsen, and I'm gonna have 140 on FanDuel, and I'm gonna be looking at my 0 for my tight end, like I did with Safarian Jenkins last week. It's gonna be great.
Yeah. One thing to mention about Rudolph, was banged up coming out of that Carolina game in a walking boot. I like him here if he's in. There hasn't really been anything to say that, you know, he's going to be out this week, but something to note. But this is a good spot for him. You look at Cincinnati, 28th in DVOA against tight ends this year, allowing 60 yards per game. Like Rudolph's been kind of that second guy. He's been a pretty safe cash game guy, double-digit fantasy points in each of the last 4 games. He's the red zone guy as well. So, yeah, I think, like you said, Rudolph's probably the cheapest that I'm going to be going because after that, I mean, unless Zach Ertz gets ruled out
Right.
again, then Trey Burton's in
And then
play.
you
But
play, then you just automatically put in Trey Burton if you don't play Gronk. But other than that, I mean, yeah, you just hang out, you just hang in the upper tier, the Upper East Side, at tight end.
yeah, for sure. Let's move on to defenses here. There's basically about 3 or 4 that I'm kind of enamored with this week. And it's kind of easy. I think the Saints and Jaguars are still they're 1-2 for me this week.
Who'd you say?
Jacksonville and New Orleans.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. And with a little star next to New Orleans, they get the little bonus points this week for not having to face Josh McCown. So, the line of that game is just absolutely hilarious. It's gonna be an absolute. It's gonna be what I thought the Jets were gonna be, this whole year before Josh McCown saved them. So I'm ready. This is my redemption for the Jets making me look wrong all year.
Yeah, this is finally your week 15. It's your time to shine, Russ.
I'm finally gonna be right.
It's hard to stray away from those two. I like your Dolphins call as a cheap defense this week if you can't necessarily get them in. I'm with you. I mean, 7 fantasy points in each of the last 3 games. 2 of those games were against New England. We saw them pop off, obviously, against Denver. Buffalo, obviously, a team that's kind of dismantled at the offensive end. Like, as much as I did like McCoy, he was the only one,
Mhm. And yeah, and the Dolphins have looked pretty stout against the run the last 2 weeks. So that's certainly I won't say cash game. I think you have to play the Saints pretty much in cash, but for tournaments, I wouldn't mind getting quite a bit of exposure to them.
No, I think the Dolphins are a good tournament option for cheap. I think the only other defense that I was really looking at here was the Vikings at home against Cincinnati. Xavier Rhodes is going to be able to get on AJ Green. Outside of that, I'm not worried about Brandon LaFell and Giovanni Bernard and these types of guys. I know the Vikings haven't been a great fantasy scoring defense this year. But this is just a team that really, I mean, they should kind of embarrass Cincinnati at home this week, and I think they're in trouble.
I think Philly's D is another one to look at.
Yep.
4,700 on FanDuel. Obviously ran into a couple tough teams last 2 weeks, but they're fierce and they can cause a lot of problems for, Eli. So other than that, though, kicker. What did Denny say?
I didn't do the pod with Denny yet, so let's take a look here. Let's get a live in-depth look.
I'm all in on Justin Tucker against Cleveland. I think that's kind of the move. I think you can go back to Zurline, but Lutz, I mean, are you paying down for anyone?
All right, so you basically call Will Lutz is the top play on the board this week against the Jets.
Mm-hmm.
Mid-price plays Kai Forbath. Vikings against Cincinnati for 4,700, but he's calling out the Josh Lambo here once again. So I mean, we have some options. Zerline in a little bit of a tough spot here. Then Zerline's going to put up 18 and make me eat my words, but. I'm going with Lutz. I think if you're playing or if you're playing on FanDuel, otherwise I think you can kind of look at Forbath and Lambo here, as Denny said.
Fair enough.
So that's it for us. You can check out dailyfantasycafe.com for our great tools and content. Cheat sheets will be out Wednesday evening, Thursday morning for the week. Be sure to check out our optimizer, of course, for the Thursday, Saturday slates, whatever you are playing this week, whatever tickles your fancy. As Russ says, Russ doesn't really say that, but I think he does sometimes off
and
air.
I do this, and I do this. Tickles your fancy.
I'm not going to tell you to put anything in my mouth like Russ did 2 weeks ago. We're just going to end it. And anything else?
Nothing else.
So good luck in week 15, and we'll see you guys next week.